Welcome back to Free Founders, where we share actionable lessons from the world's best solopreneurs and small business owners. This is for aspiring entrepreneurs who want proven strategies to go from zero to first sale and onwards to scale and enjoy the freedom that comes along with it. My guest today is Jason Knight. Jason Knight is host of One Night in Product, one of the leading product podcasts, consults in fractional leadership, and a bit of a super connector in the product world. He's also changed direction in a big way with his career over the last 5 years, and a lot of things to learn from his journey. In this episode, expect to learn 1, the secret to launching and running a successful podcast without a big personal brand to start. 2nd, how to leverage an audience to drive a paid product offer. And thirdly, looking at the pros and cons of podcasting as a platform for building brand and building acquisition. I was really looking forward to this one. Selfishly trying to learn a lot about podcasting as I start on my own journey, but there's a lot to learn for anybody thinking about starting their own business and starting their own podcast. Jason, so you spent 19 years at the same company. I mean, it looks like that was almost start of the career, right? 19 years. You then go into a startup and scale up. What triggered that?
Well, I mean, it wasn't even the start of my career. So let's call out. I'm getting on a bit these days. I'm an old man.
I mean, I didn't want to say, but
what can I say? But with the appropriate use of lighting and filters, I can make myself look really haggard. So it's fine. But no, I mean, it's an interesting point, right? And like we said just before we started recording, I don't think I'd do 19 years at one place again. Like it's a long shift. But it wasn't my first job, but it was pretty much my first job. Like I worked for a couple of years. I mean, I dropped out of uni after a year. I didn't quite kind of handle like a country bumpkin like me. I grew up in the Kent countryside. I went up to Liverpool, fantastic city, all of the lights and the attractions of the city in front of me. And I just went completely insane and threw myself into that and forgot to study and ended up, dropping out and going back to Kent with my sort of tail between my legs and sort of started working a call center, a market research firm, and that was a 2-week job, which became a 2.5 year job. And then I eventually, using my computer skills that I developed from an early age, ended up getting into their kind of basically IT team, and then everything kind of went from there. So yeah, fast forward a couple of years, started work at a company which then got acquired by another company, which kind of was the big corporate that was the one that I've kind of got on my CV. And yeah, I was there for 19 years from the kind of the point that I joined through the acquisition and then all the way through to the end. And it's interesting because I sit there and sometimes I think, well, that was a long time. I probably shouldn't have stayed there for as long as I should. And maybe I could have gone and done something different sooner. But actually, in many ways, it's like the beginning and the end of my time there. It really felt like the more transformative things for my career and kind of the ones that set me up for more what I'm doing today. And there was maybe a middle, which was still fine, but it was maybe not as relevant to what I'm doing now. Much more operational, much more kind of corporate, whereas a lot of the stuff I did at the beginning and at the end was much more producty and tech and development. So that was really the kind of the weird U-shape, I guess, of the career at that company. But as for why I moved on to a startup, I mean, again, like by 19 years, I'm kind of almost gold watch territory at the company, right? Like I'm there for life. And the thing that really kicked it off for me was the company got acquired by a big private equity firm called KKR, one of the biggest back in a few years back. They had a real strong desire to quote unquote digitally transform the company. And obviously, that's got, that term has connotations, but at the same time, I genuinely believe that they wanted to do that, for decent reasons, aside from money. Like it was a very traditional industry. It needed disrupting. And there were lots of small disruptors coming up and about and sort of snapping around these big established firms, which, the types of firm that I was working for. And as part of that, they, divested a bunch of old bits of the company. And then, all of us that were left were kind of tasked with doing this new thing. And they brought in a bunch of leaders from out and about, like from other, like less established, more tech savvy companies. We started to see new faces. We started to hear new thinking. And some of that thinking I looked at or listened to, and I was like, well, yeah, I've been doing that stuff for years. Like you start to realize that a lot of the stuff that you've been doing before was product management. We never called it that. This was a big multinational, effectively agency that we were working for. But we'd been trying to standardize stuff for years. I've been building products for years. actually even AI products, which is hilarious now looking back on it, because these days the stuff that they can do is amazing compared to what we could do then. But we were building AI products then, standardized AI products, trying to standardize the offerings that the company could take to market. But as part of it, I start sort of listening to all this new thinking and getting exposed to all these new ideas, some of which were actually new, some of which were just repackaging of stuff that I was already doing. And you start to think, well, maybe a nearly 100-year-old multinational isn't the place to do this. Like, maybe there's something more out there. Maybe I can go and do this at a cool tech startup and, remove some of the baggage of being a big company and start to maybe have more of an impact myself rather than being part of the machine. But, I'm going to say that was a tough decision, like leaving a place that you've been. I knew so many people there, and I'd known a lot of people there for so many years. I had friends there, had so much history there and so much respect there as well. Like when I actually said that I was leaving, I got so much positivity coming in from me. I can't believe you're leaving. Like, you've been so amazing, blah blah blah. And like, that sounds like me blowing smoke up my own, rear end. But when you're at a company for that long and you've had the chance to make all of the different impacts around so many different areas, of course you're going to get stuff like that. But I still felt that it was right for me. I felt that it was right to move on, try something different. So I ended up joining one of these whippersnapper type, companies that have been kind of coming up around, one of the ones that were disrupting the industry. Things like the KKR takeover were in many ways a kind of reaction against. And, so I joined one of these companies. So it was still basically the same industry, but doing things in a very different way, very AI first, or machine learning first, at the very least, trying to disrupt the way that survey research was done, trying to disrupt the way that people predict, like FMCG companies predict future trends in the market so that they can put their investments in the right place. And it was fascinating. And it was then the start of everything that followed.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you say the start of everything that followed, and we'll talk about launching the podcast in a second. That what struck me looking at your LinkedIn and going through sort of articles and interviews was 19 years in traditional company, and suddenly you then go on to do 4 or 5 different roles and launch a podcast within, I think, around 2 years. And I think that demonstrates to a good lesson for listeners is usually there is, and this is the trend I'm seeing across solopreneurs I'm interviewing and small business owners, there are steps that are building towards this, the point when you jump off and start your business. I whether that was, I interviewed someone recently, did sort of a variation in university of events that he eventually launched a business with 5 years later, or started a cafe in Tehran 15 years ago. And then that was the sort of first experience of understanding the value of customer interaction and customer value. So I think to people listening, when they think, oh my God, starting a business is a big, scary thing, it's always about steps and sort of moving towards that in some way. Let's talk about the podcast launch. So 2020, you launched the podcast. Why a podcast? Why then?
Well, that's an interesting story. And actually, if you look back on it now and you think, well, was that like a super intentional move? Like, did I already have like a dastardly master plan to do whatever? And I'm going to say, for anyone listening, absolutely not. Like, the reason that I started a podcast in the first place, and I've talked about this before, so apologies if anyone's heard me tell this story before, but like, I started to realize that when you're out on your own, well, not on your own, but like when you're away from the swaddle of a 19-year relationship with a company, and like you don't have all of the infrastructure and process and architecture around you, because it's a much smaller company, and as with any startup or scale up, it's much more chaotic in many ways. It's a lot higher pressure, a lot more stress, and all that stuff. And I'd had a fairly stressful few months. There was goings on within the company, nothing particularly bad, but like all of these things end up taking a toll. And I started to realize that I really wanted to just talk to more people about the craft of the work that I was doing, about the craft of product management. I was a leader of a product team. I had 5 product managers with me. I also looked after UX at that company as well. So we had a designer as well. We had an analyst. So I had a decent sized team. But crucially, and this is something that I think about often, these were all in the same boat as I was. No matter how good or bad the boat was, but like they're in the same boat. I've got nothing to talk to them about that isn't something that affects us all. I'm not necessarily going to get divergent ideas from them, maybe I am, because maybe they work somewhere else, but like it's not guaranteed, because again, when you're in the boat, when you're in the kind of in the quagmire, when you're doing when you're doing your work, you're all suffering or struggling with or trying to solve the same things. So I really wanted to speak to just other people. And I'd tried a little bit of medium writing before. That had gone averagely poorly. I had no network really at all, apart from a random collection of people that I'd met at events here and there, plus obviously all of the people that I'd worked with over 19 years in the other companies. I probably had I dread to think, I'd have to try and work it out, but a few hundred followers or connections on LinkedIn, like 200 followers on Twitter, as it was at the time. No real credibility or any real reason for people to even want to talk to me. And I'd go to meetups, and that was cool. Like, you'd meet the occasional people at meetups, but they had no reason to really talk to me either. And there was always loads of people there, so you never knew who you were going to get. And I just really wanted to just go out and have conversations about products. So I just thought, well, why not do a podcast? Now, that had come off the back of one of the lockdowns. I think, obviously COVID at the time. So we'd come out of a lockdown. I'd gone on a week away with the family, gone to some horrible beach resort in the south of England. Really bad. Don't go there. I'm not going to name it because, in case they come and get me. But
They'll be after you.
Yeah, we'll talk about it afterwards. If anyone wants recommendations of beach resorts not to go to in the south of England, just hit me up. But I think for me, it was just like, I'd done a lot of soul searching on that week. I'd deliberately kind of disconnected from work. I hadn't, I'd kind of disconnected from a lot of things and spent time with the family, and that was cool. But also in my own sort of reflective moments, I'd done some soul searching and just thought, I'm going to do this thing. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that having had no experience doing any of this stuff, and also fundamentally hating my own face and voice, as most people do, like, it was a hard thing for me to. Like, I remember I did Open University Spanish for a couple of years, a little bit prior to that. And obviously, for anyone that doesn't know, that's distance learning. There's a lot of kind of it's on learning before it became fashionable with the pandemic and stuff. So, a lot of the Spanish tuition was online, and your assignments that you had to do, they were all recorded. So you'd have to record yourself speaking Spanish and send them in, and then they'd grade them and send them back. And I'd sit there listening to myself, and okay, fine, it was in Spanish, but I'd sit there listening to myself. That's horrible. Like, why would anyone listen to this? And that was even just back then doing kind of a Spanish thing for one person. So the very thought of going out there and putting my voice out to a bunch of people, whoever they are, was kind of terrifying for me. But I kind of just did it anyway, and put a LinkedIn post up. Hey everyone, no Twitter at the time, or no Twitter following really. Put a LinkedIn post up. Hey everyone, anyone? I mean, still got a link to it somewhere. Does anyone want to, come and chat about product? Do a podcast. I've bought a microphone. Let's go. And I had a handful of people reply. Obviously, a connection of them were people that I kind of knew already. Some of them were just random people that had seen it, like maybe come up in their feed or whatever. I was lucky enough that I used to hang out with a guy back on the London alternative scene back when I was younger and cooler, who had written a book about Bitcoin that was moderately well received. I kind of got him. He's a bit of a skeptic, and I got him on as almost like a name guest to start with, just to kind of give me a bit of confidence. And then I just started chatting to people after that, and learned everything else along the way.
If you're enjoying this episode and want to get each shiny new episode straight to whatever platform you use to listen to your podcast, please subscribe using the subscribe button below. Not needing to start with a long-term goal, I think, is such a good lesson, right? So I think it's it's a long journey with the podcast, as I'm starting to find early on in my podcast career, and it seems like a losing game just to optimize for sort of followers and listens. And sort of following your curiosity makes a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, you said it was terrifying. I mean, I for example, I pride myself on, I like first startup age 20 of just like tested stuff out. Like, I genuinely like failure and embrace the genuine like lean startup mindset, just because I've seen that the alternative's way worse, of sort of closing your ears and ego to reality. But I found deciding to start this podcast, like that's an idea that's probably been bouncing around in my brain for a year and a half, maybe 6 months more seriously. And it took a long time for me to go, this is the thing. part of that was the fact that it's going to be, realization that it is a lot of work and it is not a shortcut to whatever outcome it might be. But part of it is definitely the fear of putting yourself out there in long form content on video. I think video is a lot more scary than just writing, a post on LinkedIn. I'll talk about how I approach this, but the moment where you go, okay, I'm terrified, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like, how did you just get yourself to start?
So I remember, take a slight segue here, but I remember back in my 20s, which is getting longer and longer ago now, but I was in a band, and it was definitely not a particularly serious band. It was really just a guy that had written a bunch of music that had been relatively well received on places like mp3.com, and he decided that maybe we could start just like sort of jamming over some of this stuff, and who knows where it would go. Like maybe we'd do something one day. And frankly, the entire band was probably about 15 people. It was like the Insane Clown Posse to start with, just like so many people in the band before because and no one really had a clear role, and we didn't really know what we were doing. And then all of a sudden we got offered a gig, like because through a mutual connection or something like that, you could play a gig. You can open up at whatever such and such a show at the upstairs at the garage in Highbury in London. And of course, we'd never played live before. We'd barely really rehearsed, and we had a collection of songs, but we didn't even really have a proper cohesive band at that point. We just had a bunch of people that had been kind of noodling over some songs and, frankly, getting drunk and going clubbing afterwards and stuff. So it wasn't a serious thing. At the same time, we're like, well, why not? Like, we could try it. Like, maybe it'll be absolutely awful, and maybe it'll be fun, but like, maybe it'll be fun for us and not for the audience, or maybe it'll be fun for everyone. But let's think about whether we could do this. And it was almost like my first ever MVP. I was just sitting there and saying, well, look, first of all, a bunch of the people just started dropping off because they definitely weren't up for it. So like we ended up with a normal band size number of people. We all knew what instruments we could play. We'd kind of been jamming over the songs a bit. So we just basically rehearsed for 2 weeks, like every night or whatever, every day, and then did the gig. Now, I'm sure that gig was, by most kind of measures, not the best gig in the world. Like, I'm very sure. In fact, some of the people that were there at the time kind of alluded to that. But at the same time, there was lots of positivity. And it kind of then gave us the confidence to then go on and, get a little bit better and, maybe either buy better instruments or get a little bit better at playing the instruments or, working out what songs worked and what songs didn't work and what people liked and what they didn't like. For me, as a kind of a natural introvert as well, like, people might be slightly kind of dubious about me saying that, but, definitely throughout my entire life, the very idea of being up at the center of attention has always been a horrible thing for me. And it's something that I've had to kind of make peace with. But like as a natural introvert, getting up on stage, if I remember rightly, in like a fishnet top as well, like this is, like that was just completely bizarre for me. Why did I do that? But at the same time, that itself was the kind of precursor to then having a lot of fun, going and playing a bunch of different shows and getting to fist bump Gary Newman and, all these sorts of things, which are just like, I never would have got to do any of those things if we didn't take that leap. And also, on the flip side of that, I also know people that have maybe spent weeks, months, years trying to perfect themselves and try and perfect their band and try and perfect their playing and make sure that they're absolutely perfect. And they spend so long rehearsing that they forget to actually go out and do the gigs. Or they do one gig, and they realize they don't like it. Or that, as with podcasting and everything else, that it's hard to get people to show up for these things, that they then give up because they don't feel that it's worth it, because they put so much work into it that it, if it doesn't pay off immediately, it starts to feel like well, what's the point of all of that then? Whereas for me, if I then sort of fast forward that back to the podcast, it's like, well, what's the harm? Like, what's going to happen if it goes wrong? I had a job. I didn't need to do anything with this thing. It was just a bit of fun on the side just to see if I could have some good conversations. It was never, even at that point, like a part of a grand master plan. It was like, well, look, if I do this thing and it sucks, which frankly I was pretty sure it would, well, fine, I'll just go and do something else instead. I've not lost anything. I'm not going to get fired for doing it. I'm not going to not ever be able to speak to anyone if they don't like my episodes. Like, people will see it as what it was and then move on. But luckily, obviously not just luckily, through work as well, I started getting a little bit better as I went. I often refer to my kind of earliest episodes as almost like The Simpsons season 1. Like, it's like, Homer's not drawn quite properly yet, the voices aren't quite right, but there was enough there you can see that there was potential there for it to be something better if they just got a little bit better at doing the things. And that was really, it's very, because you say, kind of lean startup, MVP, test and learn, iterate, optimize. Like, would I do that for absolutely everything? I mean, I'm sure I could probably think of some examples where I wouldn't, but would I recommend people doing it, for example, for a podcast or YouTube thing or anything else? I mean, how many YouTube stars have you seen where like you rewind to the beginning of their YouTube channel and it's just blah, 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 like no personality and they can't talk, and but then you can almost watch the evolution of them as they go through and they get better. And as with me, they get a better camera, they get some lights, they start to look at the camera more, and you can't get good at things unless you practice doing them, and the best practice doing them is to do them.
Yeah, I completely agree. Really good example of that, Mr. Beast. I mean, not my kind of thing, but his first video is a spotty teenager talking about gaming, like he's live commentating.
Yeah.
And now he's got, I don't know, 10 million people per episode, huge budget, and that's just a process that takes time.
But you look at Marcus Brownlee as well, like the review guy, like one of the guys now that's been almost like he's almost got so much power with his reviews that people are accusing him of like closing down companies just through the strength of his reviews. And again, you watch his early videos, and again, it's just I don't know how old he was, but some young man, in really poorly lit, like could have been in a toilet for all I knew, like just talking about a thing. And then like you imagine, like, I don't know if that was part of his master plan. I don't know the guy, but what he's become, it's amazing. But you don't become what you become without starting the journey to become that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting because I've always leaned into, again, this lean mindset. So when I started the podcast, most of me said, I think probably similar to you, where it's like, okay, I've got this fear. So what's the smallest step I could take? Public commitment, right? That's going to be putting a LinkedIn post saying, hey, I'm going to start this podcast. Anyone interested in participating, or, comment interested if you want to follow. So I sort of put it out there. And then I was like, okay, well, shit, now I need to actually do the thing, right? So then you just start, as you did, just start reaching out to people, use network initially, and then sort of go from there. And actually, I found it we'll talk about this later, but I found it quite easy reach out to other people, random people. So I don't think you need network necessarily to start. But on the flip side, if you listen to, say, Chris Williamson, who runs Modern Wisdom, I think really they're like becoming the dominant podcast. I think it will become number one in the world, in fact, in the next few years. He talks about an Alex Hormozy, another very good content creator who luckily has a huge bodybuilder body, so that sort of grabs attention for people, but you can't really match him on that. But they talk about perfectionism a lot and the value of perfectionism, and I struggle to sort of fit the two things together, where they take, episodes need to be really good quality, you really need to put work in. The audio needs to be excellent, video needs to be excellent. But I don't know what your thoughts on that, and whether there's a difference between, say, starting versus when you maybe 20 episodes or 100, where you start going a bit more, taking it more seriously, let's say.
Well, I'm quite anal when it comes to especially audio quality, and maybe some of that comes from doing the music stuff back in the day, recording albums and going over the same stuff again and again, or even maybe thinking back to the Spanish exercises that I had to put in and the assignments I had to do, and kind of listening to myself again and again and again. And I'm not going to say that my audio and video quality haven't improved. I mean, I didn't do video for the longest time. I've only recently started actually putting up the videos. And it's interesting because I don't know how you found it, but as a kind of a relentlessly audio podcast for so long, I actually found a lot of people visibly relaxed when you told them, even quite well-known people, that you told them that they weren't being videoed. Now, it's almost like in The Simpsons or whatever, everyone's guts kind of come out and they all kind of relax a little bit more because they'd realize that they only have to concentrate on one thing. But at the same time, everyone realizes, and I remember Marty Kagan told me off the other week when I told him that we weren't going to be recording the video. I was like, well, why aren't you doing that? Everyone's doing video these days. And he's right. Everyone is doing video these days. And I don't even think it's that good for the actual...
He really is like the sort of the dad of product people.
Well, I mean, I was accused the other day of being a fourth-rate Marty Kagan fanboy, so I want to be careful that I don't lavish too much praise on the guy. But I think it's a fair point, but also that I don't genuinely, personally believe that video adds too much to the experience of, for example, a 45-minute, hour-long podcast. Like, I don't know about you. I don't, if I listen to a long podcast, I'm listening to it when I go for a run or for a walk. I'm not listening. I'm not just going to sit there and watch two people talking. And they're not doing anything. Look at us. We both look exactly the same, but not literally framing wise. We're both sitting here in little rectangles with some lights behind us, nodding at each other as we talk. That is not something that I want to spend an hour and a half watching. I'll happily listen to it because, of course, there's going to be interesting stuff in the conversation. But of course, the reason that people are doing the videos is because they can do the clips that they can then put up and use that to get promotion and to get interest so that people then go and listen to the audio or watch it if they want to. So I get it. But I didn't do video for the longest time. Audio was enough trouble for me, just having this kind of really keen ear for what sounded good. Like wanting to make sure there weren't any kind of egregious breaths coming through, like tongue clicks or ums and too many ums and ahs, or and all of the kind of verbal tics. Well, no, the thing is, when you start, I still to this day edit all of my own stuff as well. So I've not offloaded any of that to anyone. But it doesn't take long for you listening to yourself even to start to realize your own verbal tics. And of course, then you start to correct them, which is actually a good kind of side effect of doing some of this stuff, is that it makes you a better speaker or kind of person, presenter, just almost by default, because you start to realize what you do. It's the same as when you watch yourself on video and you start to realize how you're twitching all over the place, or I saw a video of me once when I did a training video thing for one of our help pages, and my eyes were rolling up, weird flickers in my eyelids and stuff when I was thinking. It's like, what? I had no idea I ever did that. So thank God that now I know that, so I can try to stop doing it. But I think that the most important thing for me wasn't that I didn't, or I did want it to be good quality, but I didn't want that to hold me back. So, for example, making something good audio quality is effectively a factor of getting a decent enough microphone, talking close enough to it, and thoughtful editing, right? And reducing the noise where you can. So, as a former musician, let's call myself that, I'm well aware of how to clean up audio. I can do that. I can load stuff up into Audacity or something like that, and I can run a few plugins and stuff and such to clean it all up and make it sound good. And I had enough money to buy a decent microphone. You combine those two things.
How much is a mic? Just for people listening, because I think people think it's like cost of an SLR camera like $1,000, and it's just not.
Well, so my microphone, my first microphone, which probably got me through the first 9 or so episodes, I guess, was like a cheap off-brand Amazon knockoff thing, a little condenser mic. I think it probably cost about £30, whatever that is in dollars. I think it's a kind of a 1-to-1 when you're thinking about pricing of sort of tech stuff. So probably around $30. You don't need one like that. You could just any microphone. Even your laptop mic's kind of okay.
If you've got a MacBook, it's good enough, right, to get started.
I mean, it's fine. I definitely would advise upgrading. But even if you got like a little clip-on mic, or even like a headset that you get from work or something like that, like my what's the brand? A Plantronics headset that I've got, which I very rarely used anymore, to be fair. But I've got one that's got like noise cancelling built into it. It's amazing. Quality is actually pretty good. Like if I go and do I've had a couple of situations where I've had to do a webinar in basically in a hotel lobby or whatever. You plonk this on, no one's hearing anything around you. So you can get good quality. One thing I would always recommend, or never recommend, or I'd recommend not to do, is never use a Bluetooth microphone. You can use Bluetooth earphones if you want. I've got one of them in now, but never use Bluetooth microphone, because the audio quality will always be worse. It's kind of compressed, it can cut out. I've had to have people re-record sometimes because the quality of the audio was so bad from them, their mic. But yeah, so £30, whatever, will get you like a basic condenser mic. I think if we think about this mic, for example, this is like a Rode pod mic. Other mics are available, but this was probably about 100, 120 or something like that. I had a Blue Yeti for a long time in the middle because a guest came on and had that, and I liked the way it sounded, and that was probably about the same. But the reason that I got rid of that, eventually I went through 2 or 3 of those. They have really, that's a USB one. This is XLR, so this plugs into a mixer, which plugs into the computer, whereas that was a USB one, and the USB was kind of like you moving it around and stuff, and the USB would kind of snap off every now and then. And it was a known issue, like people in the forums talking about this stuff. And after like the third replacement, I just got a bit bored of doing that. So I went for this more, well, I guess, swankier mic, an arm, and all of those things. But microphones, again, I started cheap because I didn't know if this was going to be a thing. But I just went good enough and made sure that I, spoke close enough to it and cleaned it up afterwards so that, there wasn't so much echo and things like that. Actually, I think my first couple of episodes, I tried to almost create myself a little sound box or studio box, whatever. So I kind of recorded under my desk and put like a blanket over the desk to try and reduce all whatever. And I stopped doing that because I'm quite tall and the desk isn't that high. So I started to kind of hurt my back doing it. But yeah, my top tip for people that are doing recording is get a decent mic or decent enough, speak close to it, and keep the volume down, because you can always, it's easier to pump the volume up than it is to reduce it, like if it starts to kind of distort or whatever. And like this room that I'm in now isn't like an audio treated room or anything like that. It's got, all of the same problems that most rooms have. It's quite small, I guess. But, if you speak close, if you kind of practice good microphone control, and that's something you get used to, then it'll all be fine. You don't need to spend thousands.
Yeah, I want to recap that because there's some really important things. I think firstly, as you said, the barrier to entry is so low now. $30 mic, you're just $30 mic. Some platform like access to where you can message people, like LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever the hell it is, whatever makes sense for your market. So there's no, and also, by the way, I'm using Riverside for this, and that does good quality. It's probably on the same level. I'm not sure, Jason, you can, better than me, but good quality AI audio editing. It will even do video. It will edit out your ums and ahs or likes. Like I'll add in, and it does everything for you. So it's like I could just record this right now and click publish after, and it basically is off to the races. So the barrier to entry is super low. Why doesn't everyone start a podcast? Generally, I think it's because of what we talked about around fear and just getting started with it. Starting a podcast, I'm saying, not continue. It's that fear. And I think, how do you get going? It is firstly not having some huge outcome. You want to, a million followers straight away. No, just follow your interest. Part of the reason I'm doing this is following my interest, talking to other solopreneurs, really trying to learn like what other businesses are out there. Yeah, great if it eventually is going to, help me launch a business or become an acquisition funnel. But I think going in with that mindset with such a difficult game, which is consistent audience building, I think is a losing game. Wrapping up that point around, ultimately just get started, do 3 episodes even. Do you like it? Is it interesting? Great. If if it goes well, maybe when you get to 20, get a decent 4K camera. Think about, I've got a couple of £100 in lighting. But you don't need that to get started. In fact, by the way,
cameras are expensive, right? Cameras are expensive. I don't know what you've got. I've probably got about £1,000 worth of camera sitting there as basically a webcam that never moves out of this room. And I agonized over that for a long time. But like when I started doing video, I was like, well, I don't, first of all, and maybe this is just ego, but like, I don't want to look worse than my guests. Like if they've got decent cameras, it's the same with audio. Like I remember once had someone on who had a really nice mic, and that was a Blue Yeti, as it turns out. And like he sounded so much better than me that I'm like, look, I've got to up my game now. Like if I've got people coming on that have that quality of stuff, then I need to at least approach that quality of stuff. And it's the same with cameras as well. Like I didn't, I had just like a Logitech webcam for a bit, and then I started doing the recording, started recording videos with the podcast. And then you have people coming on with, God knows what types of camera, and you look at it and you go, well, look, they look amazing. And I'm not saying that a camera can make you look amazing in the sense, you can look like what you look like, but at the same time, I want to look kind of equivalent quality to the people that are coming on. So if you're getting to a point where you're getting guests that, maybe you're getting a higher level of guest, I guess, or people that have invested in themselves, I think that's the point where you invest in yourself.
100%. I've been playing sort of mental games with myself. So I think because I've done a few businesses now and just understand the importance of consistency and just sticking with stuff. I said when I was going to do a podcast, I'm going to take it very seriously and really go to 100 episodes and then assess like what am I doing with this. But I spent 600 quid on lighting which I didn't need to do. I could have done shortcut and say got a few €50, $50. So I'm just stick with pounds or both English. £50 light, like one of the ones I've got here, which I've had for ages. But I was like, if I'm going to take it seriously, I want to put some money down to make a real commitment to it as well, to sort of up the odds for myself, or up the sunk cost. So sort of basic hacking of my own psychology. What I've done actually is to say I'm going to get to 10 episodes, and then that's like an unlock next level for me, where it's then, okay, then I'm going to invest in a decent camera. I mean, this is a 80 quid Logitech, I think. Let me stare. Lextron. I'll add that to the notes if anyone's interested. But it's 2K. It does the job for now. But as you say, it's not the same quality. So I'm sort of trying to give myself rewards at each level, but try to create motivation that isn't dependent on the outcome of more listens and more followers. Essentially, it's just about
everyone wants more listeners, right? Everyone wants more listeners,
yeah, for sure,
and I want more listeners. I want people to listen to the episodes that I put out.
By
I still
the way,
put enough work into those episodes.
Subscribe to One Night in Product if you
You absolutely should, and it's even on YouTube now as well. But it's important, right? Like, what's the point? Well, rewind. There is a point doing it if you don't get listeners. In the same way that there's a point to writing, right? Like, this is old cliche around, like, well, the more that you like either record yourself or write stuff down, or even do talks and go to talk to two people and a dog in some back room of a pub or whatever because no one came. Like, there's always a point. I had some terrible gigs when we were still doing the music stuff. I remember once literally playing only to the support band, or I can't even remember if we were the support band, but like playing to the other band and the people that had driven us there, and then they played to us. Like, literally no people came. Did that like secure our careers as top flight musicians? No, but it was still a learning experience. One of the learnings is, well, maybe we should have done more promotion for that gig. But another is just like, well, almost like forging ahead in adversity. But back to the point, like, there's a certain truth to this idea that, well, look, if I can sit there and write down my thoughts, then I'll immediately or read out or talk about my thoughts. Then I can start to listen to how stupid they sound or how good, and I can make my thoughts, or at least the way that I express my thoughts, better. I'm not going to sit there having to try and work out how to say things that I believe. And that's something, again, that you can do through writing. You can do it through speaking. You can do it through podcasts. You can do it through YouTube, TikTok, whatever. So there is a benefit to doing it. But of course, if you are going to do it, if you are going to put stuff out there, then of course you want people to watch it, listen to it, read it, whatever, because of course you do. Like, that's why you're putting it out there. Otherwise, you just write it and send it to yourself. So yeah, 100%. Everyone wants people to, to listen, read, whatever. But I remember reading an article relatively early on, which basically said, like, I can't remember what the average podcast listen, like 100 listens, 150 listens or something it was at the time. It was much lower than you'd expect. And then people are saying, well, but if you're, for example, like, if you went out, if either of us went out now and gave a talk to like 200 people in an amphitheater somewhere, that would be pretty cool, right? Like, we'd be there, we'd be able to see 200 people, hopefully, liking what we're saying. Maybe you get to meet some of them afterwards or whatever. Or if you're talking to 300-400 people, like, that's an entire like jumbo jet full of people that you've basically got their undivided attention for the length of what you're putting. If you get to 1,000 people, like, just imagine, like, the biggest gig I think I ever played as a musician was 1,000 people at some festival or another. So again, we never made it big, but we made it bigger than some. 1,000 people is an incredible number of people. Like, if you actually see 1,000 people in front of you. I remember we'd gone for sound check, and it had been an early sound check because we were one of the early bands, and we had to wait around for ages. We couldn't be bothered to go back to our accommodation or whatever. So we did what all 20-somethings would do and just started drinking, and we ended up getting quite drunk before we went on, which is obviously massively unprofessional. However, I remember walking down the side to get ready to go on, and I kind of peeked over and saw 1,000 people. And I'm like, this is insane. So whilst it's all very well sitting there thinking, well, Lenny's got millions of listeners to his, and other people have got hundreds of thousands of followers, and all these people, I'm like, yeah, great. Look, I respect them and I congratulate them on their success. But even talking to 1,000 or 500 people, if you were doing that face to face, that would still be an awesome experience. So people, I think they get a little bit tantalized by this idea of like, oh, well, such and such a true crime podcast has got whatever number of listeners. Yeah, great. Well, good for them. Will never diminish their success. But at the same time, it only matters what's successful to you. So chasing listeners or vanity numbers for the sake of it is much less important than getting the right listeners, the people that you can actually impact and then hopefully connect with afterwards, or become part of the community with, or whatever. But not just going for raw numbers, because raw numbers, they don't 100% mean anything unless you're trying to get like Squarespace ads into your podcast, because that is all about numbers. Or you need to have a certain number of listens so that you can get the advertising revenue. But if you're not talking about advertising revenue, then the numbers are fundamentally not important.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I mean, also, it's, I'm reminding myself, because I've sort of built Product MBA, my previous business, all up through LinkedIn, just LinkedIn posts, written LinkedIn posts as well. And you're getting 1,000 to 10,000 impressions, and then you go to podcasts where, I don't know, I've just launched my first one. It's probably 10 listeners would be a good outcome. And actually, that's remembering that those 10 listeners, if they've listened to an hour and a half of content, then your relationship with them is just so much stronger. And I think, and we'll come on to this shortly, and then the ability to leverage that to your business objective. So, someone that listened to you to an hour and a half, and then you go, hey, come check out my consultancy or bootcamp or whatever the paid offer is. They're way more likely to go and check that out and take it seriously than someone that's seen me sort of slagging off Agile on LinkedIn in a pithy paragraph or two on LinkedIn. So I think this is talked about a lot, right? I think any big podcasters will say that the value of the relationship is a hell of a lot stronger than other platforms, which is really important. I was going to talk about resilience and the importance of that. You've got to 205 episodes and consistency. But I think that's sort of a drum that's been beaten, right? I think we all know that you have to just keep putting lots of content out to both get better and both to build audience. Let's talk about positioning and differentiation, right? Yours is a product podcast, right? It is for people that work in product. You have Lenny, I think it's Lenny's newsletter or Lenny's podcast. I can't remember the name.
Well, Lenny's newsletter and Lenny's podcast, right?
Okay, both of them there. So Lenny's podcast, right? This big product podcast, it's probably the dominant one in this space. How do you think about differentiation there to attract new people and retain existing listeners?
Well, I just like to call Lenny out. I think it's he's done an amazing job, and I think it's incredible that, frankly, that a product podcast is as doing as well as his, because it's a relatively small niche in some ways. Now, Lenny obviously had a bunch of advantages with the following that he'd already built up before he released the podcast, but at the same time, I want to congratulate him for the incredible success that he's had and he's continuing to have, and B, he's welcome. I was there before him, so he's welcome for copying my idea as well. But it's interesting because when I started, and when many people start, when they start like their own hobby podcast, they have nothing. They have no credibility. They have no audience. They have no even you call it like a right to play in some ways. Now, obviously, like you say, it's such a low barrier to entry now that the right to play kind of goes out the window. But I'm going to also say that as much as I respect and love Lenny and all of the success that he's had, that big heavyweight podcasts like that coming out, I would definitely classify mine as a midweight these days. But like big ones like that coming out do make it harder in a sense. And obviously then the question is, well, how do you respond to that? So it makes it harder. And we were chatting about this just before we started recording, because anyone who's anyone would be delighted to go on Lenny's podcast. Because of course they would. It's got huge distribution. Lenny's a great interviewer. He gets to do all of these things, and they get to take their message out to way more people than you get from pretty much any podcast, certainly in this space. And that's fantastic. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to go on your podcast too, especially if they've got a book to promote or course to sell or whatever. Like, they will go on your podcast too. And the people that you already have, the people that you've already kind of attracted from before, or that I have, for example, in this example, they'll come and listen to it on your podcast. Of course they will, because like you say, they've already got a connection. But anyone who hasn't is just going to go and listen to it on Lenny's podcast because it's the same person speaking to them. So that doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it harder to, for example, as I tried never to do and kind of slipped into a little bit over the years, is relying on big names to help attract people. To start with, it was just anyone that I could catch up with that had a halfway interesting story from around the community. And then fast forward a little bit, you start talking to authors because you maybe get a little bit more established. You start talking to bigger names. You start talking to people that people have heard of, or people that aren't their friends have heard of. And then you start to use that as it's almost like a launch pad. Like you kind of trickle up a bit with some people that aren't high profile. You get Marty Kagan was a relatively early guest back in 2021 when just after Empowered came out, and that was a bump, and then there were subsequent bumps with different people across time as well. But I'm not 100% sure that these types of guests, well, first of all, I'm not 100% sure that they ever got you as big of a bump as you might have expected. Like, I've put episodes out with big names that have got done appreciably worse than with smaller names or sort of midweight names. But I also think that, notwithstanding that, it's still more difficult now to sit there and say, oh, Marty's coming on the podcast. And you're sitting there thinking, well, that's brilliant. But everyone's listening to him on Lenny's. So you need to find a different way to be interesting, because just relying on big names now, I think it comes to diminishing returns, which is another thing that we talked about before.
Such an important point I've never thought about around, I mean, obviously we'll talk about differentiation again, but doing something that is different and unique is bread and butter. It's bread and butter for any product, right? The world is too competitive nowadays. You have to do something different. But I think that's such an interesting point about the famous guests, because most of them, if you're a really busy person, I listen Dr. Peter Attia, I listened to this week. He's the guy on longevity, like the world expert on longevity. And I was like, so I listened to him on Chris Williams and Modern Wisdom, but he's doing his book tour. He's on every podcast right now. Yep. So I think, as you said, it's like, well, who am I? Basically, I'm choosing Chris Williamson. I'm choosing Modern Wisdom as my vehicle for getting information, as people choose Lenny as the vehicle for getting information on product versus OneNote in product. And I think it's a really good lesson about also stage, right? So stage one seems to be just get repetition so that you get comfortable and good at the craft. That's your first, let's say, 20 episodes, which, by the way, only 1% of podcasts make it to 20 episodes. If you've done that, then you're in top of the game. Second stage is, okay, try and build audience and credibility through some recognized names in your niche. So in the product niche, it is Marty Kagan. It is product leaders at Google, Facebook, etc. Names. And then I think there's that third stage, which is, okay, well, how do I now scale this? It has to ultimately be finding because also at that stage, no one's, you're probably just getting listeners from personal networks. It's like, I like Jason. We went, we're in the pub 10 years ago. I worked with Jason, whatever. I like listening to him. He's interesting. Awesome. To go to that next level is really, okay, what is my differentiation? I think that's where actually I like working. I like working with frameworks when you have experience around them. But content strategy as a framework is something I've been working with and teaching clients. And I think that's where that comes in, right? Is obviously you need to have an idea of differentiation early on, but I think going then to really scale it is around claiming your own unique voice, and perhaps going, look, just because Marty Kagan's doing his book tour and he's a big name doesn't necessarily mean I should interview him now, and definitely not about this topic, because the dominant product, in this case, Lenny, and every market's going to be the same. There will be a dominant sales podcast or marketing podcast or whatever the hell it is. And it's about actually saying, well, how can I do something a little bit different here?
Yeah, and I think, again, one of the things that I found super interesting was that when Marty Kagan brought out Transformed, then obviously everyone was in, like you say, book tour, so he was appearing on a bunch of podcasts, and I ended up interviewing him, and obviously Lenny did as well, and we both ended up releasing our episodes on exactly the same day, about 10 minutes apart. Now, that wasn't planned. That was a complete accident. I had no idea even that Lenny had spoken to him, but obviously you'd probably assume that he would. And it's interesting because the guest is the same. The topic is the same. I checked the transcripts of both interviews, and many of the talking points were the same. Not all, but many, because of course, Marty's going to be talking about his book and some of the themes from within it, and Lenny's going to be asking him about many of the same things that I've asked him about, because that's the deal when you've got someone coming on talking about a book that they've just brought out that has a certain set of opinions in it. So in theory, the only difference is me or Lenny. So you sit there and go, well, cool, much bigger following, so therefore he's going to get more listeners. But
nice
people get a chance
warm
to
fireplace in the background as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, if only I could afford such things. Maybe I just turn the lights red. But and again, it was a good interview. Obviously, both of them were good interviews because we're both experienced interviewers, and we're talking to someone that's got a point of view and an opinion, and that people want to hear from. So, you could probably go and listen to either of those podcasts, and I know that some people listen to both, and you'd be absolutely fine. Now, people that already know me or have heard of me or jive with my style or like my personality, and I think that's something that people do need to do with my podcast. I try and bring my personality to or infuse it throughout, and try and be as dad joke as I can at certain points, and try and challenge people and provoke them when I can. That's just a part of it. You have to kind of if I'm irritating to you as a person, first of all, you shouldn't still be listening to this one, but also you're probably not going to like my podcast. I'm not like a blank slate. I try and bring some of myself to it, and obviously everyone has their own style in that. And Lenny has his style, I have my style, everyone else has their own style. But if you've only ever heard of Lenny, then you're going to listen to it on Lenny and you're fine, you're done. Some people listened to it on both. Some people said they preferred Lenny's, some people said they preferred mine. Because of course they did. That's just how things work. And I'm not even competing with him. And this is going back to the positioning point. I don't see myself as competing. He's playing a different game. So who am I competing with? Well, I guess in theory, if I consider myself competing with anyone, I'm competing with other middle or midweight business or product podcasts, and hoping to get enough share of mind or voice or whatever, so that I still remain relevant or get interesting enough people that I resonate with these people. So one of the things that I've started doing recently, for example, is try and go a little bit back to almost my roots and talking to some of the non-name names. People that still have super smart, have great stories or opinions or whatever experience to share, but that they're not the people that you normally get on other people's podcasts. And also, to be honest, I've had people on my podcast in the past that I don't imagine would appear on any other product podcast ever, because they wouldn't be invited, because they're talking about something different. So I had Julie Starr on, coaching thought leader, one of the pantheon of greats on the kind of the coaching side of things. I wanted to talk about coaching. I thought that was an interesting thing. There's lots of product people becoming coaches these days. Why not go and talk to this person who wrote a book about coaching? That was good for me. I thought that it was an interesting episode. I've talked to other people that have written relatively, I guess, niche books in a way about diversity or inclusion, like books that didn't make it big but are still, the messages within them are just so important and so worthy of sharing. And if I can do anything at all to share those messages, I remember a couple of years back there was that controversy over the product manager in a pool who was talking about product management from a swimming pool, and she posted about it on TikTok, and then it got shared all over Twitter, and everyone was basically having a go at her because this was everything that was wrong with product managers, and she was a dumb this and this and that and the other. And I thought, well, that's not acceptable. So I invited her on, and we had a good chat about both the circumstances behind that video and the blowback that she got from it. There's always a message somewhere that or there's always an angle somewhere where you can have a different conversation than all of the other conversations. But even with more high-profile guests, I remember getting April Dunford on a while back now. She's been on twice, but the first time I got April Dunford on, and I'd seen something on her Twitter about how she'd once got kind of basically knocked back or told she wasn't good enough by some famous author, and that had really pissed her off or whatever. And I'm like, okay, quite, let's talk about that for a few minutes. I'm not saying that she's not told that story on other podcasts, but she's not told it on all podcasts. I don't want my podcast to be like the boring repetition of other people's podcasts. I want to get at least one thing from each guest that is different to what other people get from that guest. Because if I'm not doing that, then I've got myself to blame that they just go and listen to that podcast instead.
Yeah. No, I asked myself that, and it's like, well, what is the point of listening to this? You it's in their interest to just go, say Lenny, if he were a hell of a lot better than you, and interviewing the same person, same question, you're actually going to do them a favor by just saying, just go listen
Yeah,
to
100%. He's got
Lenny's
more
episode.
listeners. Go and listen to
I would
it there
say
and move on.
I would not listen to his. I'm not a massive fan. I don't know. Bit American-y, a bit sort of too sticking to the script.
Well, he is American. I mean, I don't think you can blame him for that. But that's another thing. No, I am British. I do have a certain British sensibility and cynicism and sense of humour. I bring a little bit of,
the brand.
Well, I mean, it's funny actually, and it maybe doesn't. It's maybe not 100% obvious, but like a little bit of the energy of podcasts that I used to listen to, like Guardian Football Weekly, podcasts that probably most people that listen to this have never even heard of, or they've probably heard of the Guardian. But like, the kind of the energy and the chat. I like things like the Vergecast, which is American, obviously, but like where they're just kind of there's a certain irreverence about it as well. Back when I was a kid, I used to get a magazine called Your Sinclair, which was for the ZX Spectrum back in the day, like probably before your time, because you're a youngster, not like me. But like that was one of 3 computer magazines talking about the same computer and the same games. And of course, there wasn't like these days. It was back in the old day. There weren't that many games out all at once, and you had to get the magazine once a month. And there were 3 magazines all talking about the same thing. And there was Sinclair User, there was Crash, and there was Your Sinclair. And Sinclair User and Crash were kind of a bit boring, and Your Sinclair was kind of irreverent and feisty and fun. With occasion, they had a copy of Viz, which is an adult comic. They kind of got a special copy of Viz made that they shared with all their readers as well to kind of promote Viz, but also kind of there was an edgier magazine. Now, I'm not going to sit there and say that my podcast is edgy, but I certainly like to bring some of those sensibilities in. Like,
bring an
first
edge
of all,
to it, right?
Well, yeah, it's like, first of all, every single episode of my podcast is a serious, it's on a serious topic. We talk about serious things, and if you come away from that episode, you will hopefully know something that you didn't know before, or be inspired to think about something. It's not going to change the world. Like, you're not going to come away from a podcast and all of a sudden all of your problems have gone away. But it's got enough in there. It's got enough meat on the bone to make it a useful listening experience. You will learn something from every single one of the episodes that I put out, because I want that's a strong value of mine. But I also want people to be entertained.
Sorry, but I really want to jump in on that, just to similar philosophy, just to make this actionable for people thinking about their own podcast, whether it's existing or new. I think there's 3 really key tips here around positioning specifically. So positioning is like, how do we communicate? We can be different, but if we don't communicate it effectively to the audience, then they don't know about it, they don't get it. I think one is this sort of what I call well, not me, but the book positioning would call the uncoke position, which is saying, okay, there's dominant player, Coca-Cola, let's say, or Lenny's in the product space. How do we sort of do the opposite of that? So, for example, in my category, I think how I built this is by NPR is like the big player when it's sort of how to build a business, tips and tactics. So my uncoke position is like, we're just looking at solopreneurs or just looking at small businesses, not how did, what's his name, Chesky build Airbnb. So like we look at small businesses, like we're uncoke, we're 7up. The second one is just really double down on one thing and doing it really, really well. So I think in your case, it sounds like it's sort of like real talk, real stories that goes beyond the surface level, sprinkled in with a bit of sort of quirky British brand and voice around it as well.
Which you'll love or you'll hate, but like if you want it, it's there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with Product MBA, my previous business, that was the thing I went all in on, was hands-on actionable learnings. It's like, rather than just being a theoretical course, it's all about build a real product, and then, oh, by the way, we're going to teach you product management on the side. Or third thing is niching down and saying, well, look, someone dominating the product category, what if I look specifically at just helping product managers in early stage startup, or product managers in B2B or AI startups, or whatever it is, like go really niche. I think there's just sort of 3 ways to think about, if you're thinking of launching a podcast, where you could go with it. Because again, don't worry about it at the start, just get going, build consistency, get repetitions. What I find it super interesting the way you think about goals as well now, because let's look, if we look at this on paper, you've got a dominant player in your category, and he's a full-time content creator, really hard to compete with, but you're still showing up, you're still getting episodes out. What keeps you motivated now? First question. And secondly, how does the podcast play into your solopreneurship journey, right? You as a business person and your business goals. And maybe it's the same question.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because like the motivation question, and once you get to 200 episodes, and frankly, once you get to 100 episodes, I don't think that I've seen a single podcaster talking about this stuff, and I include myself in that number, that doesn't kind of talk about kind of up and downs. Like, so for example, I remember, maybe 2 years in, and you every other week you're talking to like some, top author or something like that, or some big name in the field, or you kind of feel like you're on a roll. Like, this thing's going to go on forever, and like you're still growing quite a lot, because maybe you're getting attention from people that you didn't get before. And again, if we think about before Lenny, and maybe there were fewer big competitors in the space that would be talking to these names too. Always some, obviously, but like you could normally find an angle or get something together. But then over time, maybe you have a couple of interviews that didn't go as well as you thought that they could have done, or maybe you realize that you started talking about many of the same topics. I certainly had a period where I'm like, well, I'm just talking to like author after author after author. And again, that's not to diminish any of the interviews. Like, every single interview was, in my opinion, top notch. But you start to realize that you're just talking to the famous people now, and you're not bringing any of those diverse perspectives to the table. And that's something that I'm very conscious of, and that I'm desperately trying to work out ways to engage in a way that still interests people. But at the same time, it is a lot of work. I mean, I don't use a lot of AI, if any, to this day, really. I mean, I experimented with some stuff. It never quite hit my quality bar. So I'm still having to sink time into doing these things, which is a lot of time, especially when you're, as you say, your own businessman now. So I'm now having to go out and do
ROI
work.
becomes,
Well,
the
yeah,
rate of
and
return
then
becomes
this
a
is the
huge thing.
biggest question. Where's the ROI? Now, I sit there and I think back to when I first decided to go into being a freelancer, going out and consulting, and kind of using my own expertise and selling my own expertise. And after basically spending the best part of 25 years as an employee, that was definitely a big thing for me, and it was something that I had to work out what to do about. And that's another thing where you kind of just test, learn, iterate, improve, etc. And there's certainly been points as an employee where having a podcast, I mean, I think really the social media was more of a drag on some bosses than the podcast. Like, every now and then you'd post something on social media and you'd get pulled aside because, oh, was that about us? So, well, no, it wasn't, but okay. But like, you start to wonder, like, if you're having those conversations, well, can I say all these things on the podcast? But also, as an employee, you've got to realize that no one cares. Like, no one in your company really cares about your podcast. That there's no these people just want to do their job, and they want you to be their boss
There's not
or their
like a
colleague.
committee sitting there like watching, like, what's Jason up
No
to?
one cares. Like, and I very quickly realized that you just don't bring it up. Like, as an employee, if you have a podcast or if you're a big content creator or whatever, like, first of all, I'm not sure how long you can sustain that, because I think it will get in the way. Second of all, don't bring it up. I don't think it helps your credibility with your colleagues, with your reports or whatever. I think it, if anything, makes you look worse, because people think, is he just going to use me as an example for his next post, or was that thing that he wrote or talked about in such and such a podcast, was that about me? Was that like a subtweet about me? It's like, well, no, it wasn't, but I can see why you think that, so maybe I shouldn't say that next time.
It's quite
And I
interesting.
still
So
have
just ego there, just how everyone thinks everything's about them.
Well, everyone thinks that their own situation is unique, and everyone can also see aspects of things that have happened to them in any kind of more generic statements, which means that if that's something that happened recently, maybe they do think it's about them. And I'm not even going to blame them for that. But I also, to some extent, think that kind of going heavy on content is potentially a net negative for an employee, simply because if I'm hiring someone, or if I'm working with someone, or if I'm wondering if someone's committed, or whatever, whatever's happening in a role, do I really think that they're going to be spending all of their time working for me? Now, I'm putting myself in the imaginary shoes of some manager or boss now, but that's the kind of mindset which I've been very curious about, because I certainly am aware of content creators who did have full-time jobs and then basically gave up on the full-time jobs. And partly that could just be because full-time content creation is, a bit of a full-time job on its own. Part of it could simply be the fact that, and I've certainly heard whisperings of this with regards to certain content creators who I definitely won't name, that maybe they basically got kicked out because they were spending too much time on the things that weren't their job, and heaven forbid, maybe even doing the things whilst they were supposed to be working or getting stuff late. I don't know how many of those things are true. Maybe it's all hypothesis and rumor, but I can certainly see why a boss would think that, even if
I'm
it
sure it
wasn't
is
happening.
true though. For most people, you're even if it's just being distracted by responding to like LinkedIn messages.
Well, exactly.
Like,
I'm supposed to be doing some stuff. I'm checking my Twitter in an interview or in a meeting or something like that. Like, who knows? But like, even if it doesn't happen, the perception that it could happen, I still think is a limiter on a career. However,
sure.
as a freelancer, I don't think that's a problem, because of course you're by definition you're your own boss and you can do your own things, and as long as you do the things that the people that are paying you expect you to do, then it's all cool, right? Like, they're not your boss, they don't control your time, and as long as you've not signed some kind of exclusivity thing where you're saying that I'm literally only working for you for the next 2 weeks, then do what they'll will, right? So I think that is a problem, I think, for for people that have jobs, and maybe it's the natural end state of anyone that goes too hard on content, that they have to go and basically try and monetize it or whatever, become more flexible around it. I've decided so far, at least, to at best very lightly monetize what I do through, for example, sponsorships or whatnot. Like, I don't want to start charging people for stuff. The reason that I don't want to do that is because, well, first of all, you never know who's going to buy it, and that just that's just additional effort as well, sorting out VAT and all that. Like, it's just international VAT, and it's just horrible. But also, I genuinely love giving back to the community. I love sharing stuff. I love, you said earlier about connecting people as well. I love doing all of that stuff. But also, I just wanted to stay super, super close to the craft of product management. I didn't want to become a talking head or a reporter. I wanted to, or a curator or whatever. I wanted to stay close to product management, and I wanted to stay close to teams. So I very specifically and explicitly, when I decided to go out freelancing on my own, decided not to kind of try and go down that content grind route. And also, like, I don't even know if I'd enjoy it, like having to kind of be insightful and interesting and kind of concise and whatever on a weekly basis. Otherwise, I don't get paid, or people start unsubscribing, whatever. Like, I like working with teams. I like making a difference, or at least trying to make a difference to organizations. So I very specifically chose that, and the content remains on the side. Now, back to ROI. Does that mean that, for example, doing the podcast or writing my newsletter or doing LinkedIn posts gets me loads of money or leads or whatever? Now, I'm going to say I don't know, because I can't prove what would have happened if I didn't have these things. Like, if I'd have decided, having never done any of this stuff, to, go freelancing anyway, like, I don't know what would have happened. I can certainly guess and say that it would be hard, because I know a bunch of people that don't have those things, that have gone out to try and do that stuff after a certain point in their career, and they found it hard. There are so many people on LinkedIn these days that are going like, I'm a freelancer now, I'm a coach, I'm a consultant, I'm a fractional, whatever. And I'm glad for them, every single one of them. Like, and I'm glad for the positivity that they get when they do that. I'm glad for the opportunities that they've opened up, and I'm just going to assume that all of them have been through some kind of deep thought process. And I'm glad that they've kind of discovered themselves. They've worked out what they want to do. They've worked out what brings meaning to them. I want them all to succeed, but they're not all going to succeed, because sadly, that's not how life works. I definitely know personally some people that have been really struggling to find work, because it's a crowded marketplace. Just like with podcasts, you need to build that audience or credibility to get hired. Now, obviously, if you've got a decent network from your own personal whatever work that you've done in the past, or people that absolutely tap those people up. But am I going to say that, for example, having a podcast with decent numbers of listeners and having decent sized LinkedIn followings and all of that, am I going to say that's had no impact on the kind of work that I can pick up or the credibility that people attach to me? No, I'm going to be pretty sure that it's at least somewhat on people's minds. Notwithstanding also the fact that, of course, it's helped me grow as a as a communicator and as someone that can, the things that I've learned even just from talking to these people, let alone the things that I've actually learned through doing in my career, and then the ways that I've learned to communicate this stuff. So I think ultimately, I mean, I was thinking about this earlier actually, like if I turn the podcast off tomorrow, if I just didn't do any more episodes, like would I then all of a sudden lose all of that? And I'd probably say no, I don't think I would. So then why do I keep doing it? Well, because it still remains so far fun, having chats with people, people like yourself, having chats with people about interesting things and sharing them with people. Is it like a massive lead generator? Can I attach a revenue number to it? Not at all. If I turned it off tomorrow, would I still get work? Almost certainly. So, I think this is something that I chatted about or posted about on LinkedIn a few weeks back now. Don't just do podcasting because you think that it's going to get you leads. Like maybe it will, and good luck to you. But you should only do it. So it's a big investment in time, and there's a lot of effort to try and grow the podcast and get in people's default playlists and stuff like that. It's not like a quick click your fingers and all of a sudden I've got like 25 inbound leads. This is podcasting is a long game. Long form content takes a lot of time to prepare, to do, to record, to edit and put it out there and do all of the things. So only do it if you love it. Don't do it just because you think it's another marketing channel, in my opinion.
I think that's excellent advice, and so I was just really like listening in and really taking that all in. Jason, we haven't even got through half of the questions I wanted to ask, but that's, I think, is a sign of a good podcast. Just going really deep on like what does it actually mean to start a podcast, carry it on, and we just started touching upon sort of where that's led you in terms of consulting, be able to work for yourself, and I'd love to do a part 2 on that, talking about pricing, monetizing, leveraging that platform with a paid offer. Is there anywhere people could find you, listen to the podcast, listen to this? Lenny's is rubbish, by the way, in my opinion. But...
Again, well, look, again, I don't tend to listen to product podcasts because I've got my own and I don't want to be accused of copying people. And it reminds me of the great author Terry Pratchett back in the day, who used to be very active in fan forums, Usenet as it was at the time, and he'd be on all of the discussions. And then one day he sent in a regretful post saying that he had to basically absent himself from the forums because he didn't want to be basically accused at one point of having copied someone's idea into his book, even if he hadn't done that, but that basically it had either subconsciously or just coincidentally been the same thing, that somehow that would then end up blowing back on him. So obviously it's not quite that dramatic with me, but I generally don't tend to listen. It's a bit of a busman's holiday for me to go and listen to product podcasts. But I'm going to go on the record and say that I think Lenny is a wonderful success. I don't have anything bad to say about him, and I'm just in awe of the things that he's done. So you're not going to get me, you're not going to trap me with in this kind of trap of slagging off my competitors. But at the same time, if people want to come and listen to mine, obviously it's on all the podcast apps. It's onenightinproduct.com, night with a K. It's on YouTube these days. You can go there from the website too. And obviously, just hook up me on LinkedIn as well. I'd love to chat. I'm a big believer in authentic connections. So I don't just, like some people, they just sort of sit there and they're kind of just transmitting and they don't reply, or everything's clearly been ghostwritten, or maybe even ChatGPT these days. But I'm a very big believer in authentic connections. Like there's a Slack community that comes off my podcast website. There's meetups that we do. There's virtual networking. There's real life pub networking. I try and give as much back to the community as I can, but partly because I think it's the right thing to do, but partly because I just like meeting these people as well. So I think it's important for us all to realize that we're all in this together, not just that there's a bunch of up in the sky people kind of proclaiming things to people. Like they do exist too, but I'm much more on the side of the ones that get involved and give back and collaborate with people rather than just talk at them.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend following Jason. I think your posts are generally insightful, and they're always insightful from what I've read. And for news on things like meetups, pub thing, wherever you are, I think is great. I think particularly in a remote world, right, where people just haven't come back to connecting in person. I think there's
connections are important. Connections are important.
Super important. Yeah, I mean, it's basic human thing. Look, Jason, I loved it. Honestly, it was a huge amount of notes, a lot to think about for myself and hopefully for listeners as well. And thank you so much for joining. Thank you for listening to another episode of Free Founders. If you enjoyed this episode and want to get each shiny new episode straight to whatever platform you use to listen to your podcast, please subscribe using the subscribe button below. If you're feeling generous, why not share with a friend?